The room was unusually quiet that morning, as though an invisible hand had pressed a hush upon every object inside 221B Baker Street. A single violin string, still trembling from some restless experiment of Holmes's the night before, cast a faint, lingering note into the stale air. A cup of cold Darjeeling sat by the window where Holmes had forgotten it, a thin skin of chill forming on its surface. Beside it lay an unopened telegram, its blue paper slightly crumpled, as if someone had hesitated before delivering it. Watson paused near the desk, noticing the subtle disorder, the brass-bound magnifying glass tilted at an angle, ash scattered in a pattern too deliberate for accident, and the faint, acrid scent of chemicals drifting from Holmes's bench, where a glass pipette lay shattered as though dropped mid-thought. It felt as if the room itself had held its breath overnight, waiting for Holmes to stir. Holmes stood by the fireplace with his back turned, unusually still, staring at the silent coals as if reading secrets in their cold arrangement. Only when the street below rattled with the distant wheels of a hansom cab did he finally speak, his voice low and contemplative. "Watson," he murmured, "something has found its way to us this morning. It is here, in this room, quietly insisting upon being heard." His gaze drifted toward the unopened telegram. There was something almost solemn in the way he regarded it, as though he sensed a thread leading to darkness, already tightening around some unseen life. When he finally handed it to me, I felt a chill before I had even broken the seal. In recounting this case, I have often felt a peculiar duty to those who follow our chronicles with such avid curiosity. If you wish to understand how the smallest tremor of that violin string grew into a labyrinth of human fear, cunning, and tragedy, then stay with me a little longer, for what began as a quiet morning in Baker Street soon became one of the most haunting inquiries of Holmes's career. The telegram lay between us like a small, insolent thing that had the audacity to insist upon being read at once. Its paper, of that thin blue stock one finds in railway offices and telegraph rooms, trembled slightly beneath my fingers. I remember the faintly metallic tang it left upon my nasal sense, as though the ink itself were impatient to speak. Holmes pushed back from the mantel where he had been discoursing on a chemical anomaly of no consequence to the matter at hand. The violin lay quiet upon the sofa, and for a moment the whole of 221B seemed to listen with me. The handwriting upon the envelope was cramped and hurried, and when I broke the seal, there bloomed upon the page small strokes of crimson, not the ordinary black of a clerk's haste, but red, as if the words themselves had been bled into being. The message was brief. Even the telegraphist had avoided flourishes, perhaps intimidated by what he carried. It began with a name I had not encountered in our records: Miss Clara Morley, governess, Greystoke Hollow. Beneath the address came a single line that arrested me. "He takes my dreams and writes them back to me. Pray send Mr. Sherlock Holmes." The letters of that last sentence trailed away as though the hand that wrote them had shaken with exhaustion, and along the margin ran a streak where something had blotted, as if a thumb had smeared a tear into the ink. The sight of that smear, red as dried currant, transmitted to me an immediate and private alarm I can scarce describe. It was one of those small but certain tokens which, in a man of observation, will sometimes speak more loudly than pages of testimony. Holmes read the telegram twice, each time with that peculiar compression of the mouth which I have learned to watch like a gauge of his thought. When he handed it back, there was no mirth in his eye. Instead, a comprehension as delicate and ruthless as a surgeon's instrument. "Watson," he observed quietly, "the utilization of red ink in a plea is suggestive. There is deliberate theatricality in such a choice, not merely to alarm, but to convey intimacy or ownership. The writer fears possession." The warmth of the room seemed to retreat under that word. The fire gave a small, reluctant sigh, and the clock on the mantel chimed a note which, in some odd sympathy with Holmes's remark, sounded like a footstep in an empty corridor. I confess that the image the telegram conjured in me was less that of immediate peril than of a mind besieged by intimations. A young woman whose sleeping hours had been invaded and then transcribed by another, until what was private lay upon her pillow like a thing exhibited. The notion of one's dreams being rendered in ink appeared at once fantastical and obscene, and yet the blot upon the margin and the clipped earnestness of the language forbade the indulgence of skepticism. There are moments in a man's life when he recognizes the precise texture of danger. It is at once personal and strange, like the first sting of a nettle upon the wrist. I felt that prick now, and it set my mind to that alertness which has, more than once, served us in the pursuit of truth. Holmes proposed we set out that very afternoon. His manner was that of a physician summoned to a sick room where the symptoms were curious and the remedy uncertain. He took from a drawer a list of chemical suppliers and made a quick notation with a pencil, a tiny private ritual of preparation which, though practical, had in it the charm of ceremony. I observed, too, how he folded the telegram with care, such that the red smear did not mar its face. His fingers moved with the exactness of a man who knows the value of a single piece of paper in the theatre of minds. "We shall go to Greystoke Hollow," he said. "There is more in this than a simple household fright. This writer names no villain, yet indicates an intimacy with the sleeper which suggests, at the least, an intruder of a very particular sort." On the journey, as the hansom rolled away from Baker Street and the familiar bricks and gas lamps shrank in the rear, I had leisure to examine the telegram once more. The red ink varied in tone where the hand had paused. Here the line was sanguine and dense. There it thinned to a mere suggestion, as though the writer had been forced to conclude before the thought had finished. I've always fancied that handwriting betrays more than character. It may hint at temperament, at habit, at the friction of waking hours upon nerves. Clara Morley's short, broken lines suggested a woman of no small refinement who had known constraint and had learned to compress her distress into economical strokes. The tear-smeared margin, however, spoke of a recent outburst, an emotion so urgent that it had ruptured the composure she otherwise affected. Holmes watched me reading with an affection that was almost like amusement, and yet there was steel beneath the smile. "You see the drama," he said, "but do not yet see its engine. The red ink is an instrument. Who supplies it? Who knows her hand? Observe, too, the name chosen for the house. Greystoke Hollow. Hollow affords us an image of absence, perhaps of a vacancy deliberately maintained. The wheels of the hansom beat out a hollow rhythm upon the cobbles that seemed to respond to his words, and a faint smell of damp straw from a passing cart mingled with the more stubborn odor of coal from the cab's lamp. Such trifles only to some, placed upon my mind a map of particulars which Holmes was already fitting together like pieces of a device. We travelled through a countryside which, though it has in other seasons a pleasing breadth, now seemed to me, under the low November sky, a succession of shadowed slopes and barer hedgerows. The air carried the dampness of the river we crossed and the distant barking of farm dogs. A single gull wheeled low and sent to my ear a raucous note like a herald. All these sounds and scents I catalogued with that obedient attention of an army surgeon preparing to meet an infection whose origin is obscure. And in that quiet collection, the telegram's crisp red scratches remained dominant, an index finger pointing to an intimate violation. I reflected that a servant's report might yet explain much, for houses keep the temper of their people and often, in grocers' bills and scullery gossip, reveal what the drawing-room conceals. Before nightfall, we approached Greystoke Hollow, a lodge-bound house that brooded upon a slope with something of the patience of old stone. Its windows were small, its roof low, and a line of yew trees arrested the eye like a battery. As we drew near, a maid came out to meet us, bringing the smell of recently swept hearth and the neatness of household order, yet her face was pinched and her hands trembled perceptibly against the sleeves of her apron. She carried with her a folded sheet of paper which, when she offered it, I recognized as a specimen of Clara Morley's hand. A small child's line drawn in red ink, a crude representation of a house and a woman standing beneath a window. The sight of that childish drawing, the bluntness of the strokes, the earnestness that knows nothing of adult artifice, cut through me more sharply than any eloquence. It was at once an appeal and a confession. Holmes took the paper and set it beside the telegram upon his knee. The two objects, humble in themselves, were for the moment the instruments of a drama which had only just begun to assemble. He looked upon them with the patience of a man who would read in such trifles the bearings of motive and method. The last glimmer of sunset struck the panes and threw a thin bar of light across the red drawing. In that narrow slice, the ink gleamed like a promise of revelation, and I felt, with a painful certainty, that before the night closed over Greystoke Hollow, we should see things in a manner which would not easily be forgotten. The first sensation that met me as I crossed the threshold of Greystoke Hollow was not the chill, though it was keen enough to make the skin along my forearms prickle, but the unmistakable feeling that the house itself was listening. It was an impression so subtle I might have dismissed it as the product of fatigue from our journey, had not Holmes, stepping just behind me, paused with that peculiar backward tilt of his head which signaled that something in the air had arrested him. The silence of the entryway was of an unnerving breed. It lacked the warmth of domestic quietude and instead carried the weighted expectancy one associates with a room where someone has only just left, or where someone else still hides. A draught moved along the baseboards near my boots, not the honest gust of poor insulation, but a deliberate, searching breath, as if drawn along corridors we had not yet perceived. The maid who greeted us, a thin creature named Eliza with anxious eyes, shut the door carefully, as though any sudden noise might disturb something lurking upstairs. She gestured toward the drawing-room, but before we could follow, Holmes turned a slow circle upon his heel, observing the walls, the faint scuffing near the stair-treads, the disturbed fibers of a carpet-runner that seemed to show the path of a nightly wanderer. I saw his gaze track upward, following the balustrade to the landing above, where the shadows pooled with a suspicious density. "A house that does not sleep," he murmured, almost to himself, "leaves traces of its vigils." Eliza stiffened at the remark, and I sensed at once that she understood too well what he meant. Her hands, clasped before her, twitched at the knuckles. In the drawing-room the fire had been lit, though to little effect. The flames crackled, but sent out no warmth. Rather, they seemed to shudder, as though disturbed by faint currents from unseen gaps in the walls. The furniture stood in stiff arrangement, the kind a housekeeper maintains with rigid pride, yet there lingered upon the air a disquiet that no polish or order could dispel. Upon a small escritoire near the window, I saw a sheet of paper laid neatly upon a blotter, a recent addition, judging by the glisten of the ink. It bore the unmistakable red stroke of Clara Morley's hand. A sketch of a narrow hallway, its perspective cruelly elongated, terminating in a dark aperture from which two eyes stared. I felt an involuntary shudder. There was something about the simplicity of the drawing, its stark lines and childish boldness, that conveyed a terror more primal than any detailed illustration. Clara entered then, quieter even than the house itself. She was young, far younger than I had expected, with a disciplined composure that betrayed the influence of long years in service. Yet beneath that exterior, her eyes held the fragile brightness of someone who has not slept in several nights and whose thoughts, in the late hours, had begun to unspool into odd corners. She greeted Holmes with a soft steadiness, but when she turned to me, I felt the tremor in her hand as it touched mine. There was no theatricality in her manner. Indeed, she seemed ashamed of the telegram she had sent and the alarm it had caused. "It was foolish of me," she murmured, lowering her gaze. "Perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps only nerves." Holmes observed her with that extraordinary gentleness he sometimes displayed toward the afflicted, a tenderness concealed beneath his rigorous intellect. "Your message was not foolish," he said, "nor is fear a defect of reason. You believe someone enters your room in the night." The question, softly put, made Clara's composure waver like a candle in a draught. She nodded once, and I saw her swallow as though steadying herself to speak. "3 nights now," she whispered. "Always after I dream. I wake to find these." She motioned toward the red sketch on the escritoire. "But I never keep red ink in my chambers, and I cannot remember leaving the bed." Holmes took the drawing, holding it by the edges with the delicacy of a collector examining an etching. He studied the strokes with that microscopic attention which, once fixed upon an object, renders every other detail in the room invisible to him. "You say the dreams come first," he murmured. "Are they always the same?" She shook her head. "Not the same, but similar. I walk the corridors of the hollow, though they stretch far beyond their true length. Something follows me. I never see its face. And when I reach the end of the passage, I wake, and the drawing is there." She pressed her hands together tightly. "Mr. Holmes, I tried locking the door last night. This morning the lock was turned from the inside." The statement hung between us like a breath caught in the throat. The fire snapped sharply, and the sound seemed to echo through the room with unnatural force. Holmes set down the drawing and paced once to the hearth, his expression sharpening into that familiar, cutting focus. "You have said nothing of this to the household?" he asked. Clara hesitated. "Only to Eliza. She insisted I write the telegram, but the others... I fear they believe the house itself unsettles me, that I am impressionable." The shame in her voice stung me. Too often had I seen those suffering from unseen torments dismissed by those who refused to consider what lies beyond easy explanation. Holmes turned to the maid. "Eliza, tell me plainly, has anyone else seen or heard anything unusual?" The girl's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before she answered, "The walls, sir, they whisper." At my start, she hastened to clarify. "Not voices, sir, not proper ones. But sometimes at night, if you stand near the main landing, there is a sound like someone writing on the other side." "Scratching, sir." She flushed, as though the confession were indecent. "But when we open the panel, there is nothing behind it but plaster." Holmes shot me a glance that I understood at once. He believed there was indeed something behind the plaster, or beneath it. He asked to see the upper chambers immediately, and Clara led us up the staircase with the cautious steps of someone accustomed to glancing over her shoulder. The air thickened as we ascended. The boards beneath our feet creaked in strained complaint, and the shadows along the walls seemed to cling rather than recede. On the landing, Holmes halted. There, along the skirting board, ran a faint residue. Not dust, but a thin line of something resembling dried pigment. He crouched, rubbing a sample between his fingers. "Red ink," he confirmed softly. "And recent." Clara's room lay at the far end of the corridor, small but precisely ordered, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the yew-lined slope. The curtains swayed slightly, though the window was closed. I noted the lock upon the door, a simple brass mechanism, its key resting untouched upon the bedside table. Holmes bent to examine the lock plate, then rose with a troubled expression. "Watson," he murmured, "this lock was turned without force. Someone had the means, or the access, to open it quietly." Clara's composure collapsed then. She clutched the edge of the washstand as though the strength had gone out of her limbs. "I knew it," she breathed. "I knew I was not dreaming all of it." Holmes crossed the room and stood before her, not as an investigator, but as a protector. "Miss Morley," he said, in a voice that carried an extraordinary steadiness, "you are not alone in this, and you are not imagining it. But whoever intrudes upon your sleep does so with purpose, not violence. That distinction gives us room to act." She closed her eyes briefly, and in that moment I saw her youth laid bare. The exhaustion, the earnestness, the desperate desire to be believed. Holmes's attention turned then to the walls. He moved with deliberate slowness, pressing his fingers along the seams of the plaster, tapping here and there with the bone of his knuckle. At one point he paused, leaning close to a narrow section where the paint had bubbled slightly. His voice dropped to a whisper. "There is an interior passage here, concealed, likely old, perhaps predating the current construction." He straightened. "Watson, fetch a lamp." The moment the light touched the wall, its surface revealed a faint ripple, as though something had pressed against it from within. A sudden knock at the door made Clara start violently. It was Eliza again, pale and trembling. "Begging your pardon, sir," she stammered, "but the housekeeper says there is something you must see in the portrait gallery, something new." She swallowed. "It's been marked again." Holmes's eyes flashed with the spark of deduction. He motioned for Clara to remain in her room under Eliza's watch, then beckoned me. "Watson," he said, "the house wakes. The one who moves through it grows bolder, and he wishes us to follow." We stepped into the corridor, and as the lamp's light swung before us, I became aware once more of that strange sensation from the moment we entered the hollow. The feeling of being watched not by a person, but by the house itself, as though its bones held secrets longing to be spoken. Clara Morley awaited us in the portrait gallery with an expression poised between dread and a peculiar resignation, as though she had expected precisely what had occurred and yet dreaded the confirmation of it. The gallery stretched long and narrow, lined with ancestral faces whose oil-painted eyes seemed to follow our movements with the cold curiosity of judges presiding over some secret tribunal. Lamps flickered in their sconces, their trembling light carving odd shadows across the faces in the paintings. Even before we reached Clara, I felt an oppressive stillness in the room. A stillness not of peace but of withheld breath, like the eerie pause before an unearthly cry. The marked portrait hung near the far end, a solemn depiction of Lady Margaret Greystoke, who had died nearly a century past. She was rendered in rich earth tones, her posture erect and her gaze austere. Yet across her painted cheek there now ran a thin, deliberate streak of red ink, tracing a line that curved downward like a mocking imitation of a tear. Holmes approached it at once, examining the mark with the care of a jeweler evaluating a flawed gem. He did not touch it first. Instead, he studied the manner of the stroke, the pressure of it, the direction, the subtle trembling at its beginning. "A right-handed individual," he murmured, "and one who writes quickly, with a firm grip and little concern for precision." He leaned closer. "This ink is the same shade as the letters and drawings you have received, Miss Morley." Clara clasped her hands before her tightly. "I found it when I came to fetch my shawl," she whispered. "That mark was not here an hour ago." Her voice trembled despite her efforts. "He must have been in this room, watching." Holmes turned to her at once. "You refer to him in the singular," he observed. "You have reason to believe the intruder is a man." She hesitated, and I saw her lips struggle against some buried memory. "I cannot be certain," she said at last, "but the footsteps I've heard, they sound heavy, deliberate." She shivered as if recalling some dream that had crept too close to waking. Holmes took a small lens from his pocket and finally touched the inked surface with the lightest sweep of his fingertip. "Still tacky," he noted. "Applied within minutes." He glanced toward the windows, which overlooked the sloping yew grove. "The intruder either left through the main corridor or the concealed passage we suspect. Watson, the windows show no tampering. Therefore, we can assume familiarity with the house." He paced slowly, his gaze drifting along the edges of the floorboards, the seams in the wainscoting, the faint dust patterns disrupted by recent steps. A resident, a servant, or someone granted free passage without scrutiny. Clara's composure faltered then. She sank onto a nearby bench, her breath trembling. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a voice that seemed to shrink with the weight of some private terror, "do you believe I'm in danger?" Holmes turned to her, and his expression softened with that peculiar warmth he reserved for the vulnerable. "I believe," he said gently, "that someone in this house seeks to unsettle you, perhaps even to influence your state of mind, through carefully staged events, but intention and outcome are not the same. You are not alone, Miss Morley. Nor shall you be." His words steadied her. I saw her spine straighten, though her eyes remained clouded. It was then that Holmes asked Clara to tell us everything. Every dream, every drawing, every detail she feared might appear inconsequential. She drew a slow breath, gathering her thoughts like one selecting stones from a riverbed. "It began 6 nights ago," she said. "I dreamt of walking the passages here, though not as they are. They seemed longer, narrower, as though the house had grown tired of its true dimensions and stretched itself into some unnatural shape. At the end of the passage there was always a small door, too small for me to pass through, and from behind it I heard," she faltered, "scratching, but not of an animal, more like a pen on paper." The image chilled me. I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen. "You said this occurred first 6 nights ago, and afterward you found the first drawing?" Clara nodded. "A simple red line across a sheet, nothing more. Say the next morning, a second appeared, a small outline of a door, then the corridor, then the eyes." She hugged her arms tightly around herself. "They are always watching me in the dream, and when I wake, the drawing waits for me as though the dream were a command, and the morning its fulfillment." Holmes asked to see the collection. Clara led us back to her room, where she produced a small stack of papers tied with a piece of twine. She unwound it carefully and laid the sheets before us upon the bed. The drawings progressed in clarity, as though the artist were becoming bolder, or as though the nightmares were sharpening their own edges. The earlier sketches were faint, almost hesitant, but the later ones held a confidence that troubled me deeply. The lines were strong, decisive, almost triumphant in their intrusion. Holmes sorted them with a surgeon's precision. He paused at the 4th drawing, his eyes gleaming with sudden comprehension. "Note the smudging here," he said. "Whoever drew this used the heel of the hand to anchor their motion, a gesture inconsistent with Miss Morley's style." He gestured toward a faint indentation on the paper. "And here, the pressure. This is not a young woman's hand. It is stronger, heavier." Clara's breath caught, and I saw a flush of relief and dread mingle upon her cheeks. "Then I am not doing this in my sleep." Holmes shook his head. "No. These are the deliberate works of an intruder." Clara lowered herself to the edge of the bed. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, though she did not let them fall. "I have been so afraid," she whispered. "I feared I had lost my reason." Holmes placed a hand upon the back of a chair, the closest gesture to comfort he ever permitted himself. "Reasons do not vanish without leaving trace," he said gently. "This leaves an abundance." He then examined her ink bottle, a plain black one, untouched. The red ink was nowhere in the room. "Miss Morley," he asked, "have you ever purchased red ink?" She shook her head vehemently. "Never. I prefer black for my lessons." Holmes straightened, his expression darkening. "Then someone has brought it here, and done so repeatedly." We next questioned her about the household, who lived here, who had access, and who might hold reason to trouble her. Clara hesitated before speaking. "There is the housekeeper, Mrs. Hargreaves," she said. "She manages the servants. She has never approved of my presence." Holmes lifted a brow. "Why so?" Clara looked away. "She believes a governess should remain invisible. She resents my education. She once said I read too much for a woman in service." Holmes made no comment, but I saw his mind storing the detail. "There is also Mr. Aldrich. Clara continued softly. "He oversees the estate, though he is often away on business. He is civil, but rarely speaks. And the groundskeeper, Mr. Pell, who was injured last winter and walks with a limp. He is kind, but—" She hesitated. "He has a habit of staring too long." Holmes listened with grave attention, but it was the final thing Clara said that drew his full focus. "There is someone else who used to live here," she whispered, "before I arrived. A former tutor. They say he was dismissed suddenly, for reasons no one will say aloud." Holmes's eyes flashed. "His name?" Clara swallowed. "Mr. Thorne." Holmes repeated it softly, as though tasting the weight of it. "Mr. Thorne." He stood then, pacing slowly, piecing each thread together with that uncanny precision that so frequently left me in awe. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain. "Miss Morley, I believe someone in this house seeks to impose a narrative upon your mind, to shape your dreams, your thoughts, perhaps even your fears, by manifesting them in ink. To what end, I cannot yet say. But I assure you, the hand behind these red drawings is not a phantom. It is a mind, a will, and it is here." Clara's breath trembled. "Will you help me?" Holmes met her gaze with a stillness that conveyed far more than reassurance. "I will," he said, "and I shall not leave this house until I find the truth." As he spoke, a faint sound drifted through the corridor beyond the room, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like pen against paper. Clara froze. Holmes lifted a hand for silence, and together we listened as the house that refused sleep began to whisper once more. We moved toward the sound with slow and deliberate steps, for there are noises in old houses which require not haste but a measured approach, lest the very swiftness of investigation scatter the fragile evidence one seeks. The corridor outside Clara's door was narrow and smelled faintly of linseed and damp wool. The lamp Holmes carried threw a conical pool of light that trembled as he walked, casting the yew tree's silhouettes across the papered walls like slow-moving accusations. The tapping had ceased as we opened the door, and for an instant the silence that followed seemed to magnify every pulse in my wrist. Holmes set his lamp upon the washstand, and, without ceremony, placed his palm flat against the skirting, feeling with that extraordinary patience of his the minute give of plaster against the hidden cavity beneath. "There is a hollow," he whispered, "and within it recent movement." Holmes's method was not the noisy examination of a brute. Rather, he worked with the economy of a surgeon, listening, tapping, and illuminating. He took from his pocket a small steel implement and, with a motion both delicate and inexorable, eased away a narrow strip of baseboard where the paint had been disturbed. The nails yielded without resistance, as though habit had long ago taught them to be compliant to a hand that knew its business. When the wood fell free, it revealed a channel blackened with soot and faintly lined with the same dried red. Residue we had found upon the landing, a smeared trail as if someone had pressed a thumb to the wall and dragged it along in passing. Holmes traced that smear with a fingertip, the print of his action minimal but decisive. "See her, Watson," he said. "This is not merely the mark of passage, but of intentional leaving. A breadcrumb deliberately laid." The discovery altered the atmosphere of the house in a way that I can only describe as an increase in gravity. The rooms seemed to fold inward with a more watchful aspect, and the ancestral faces in the gallery took on a new severity. Holmes drew from the cavity a thin strip of paper, blackened at one edge as if it had been sealed there for a task, rather than left by accident. On it were faint impressions, as if the paper had lain against pressure. He held it to the light and, with that rapid facility of mental comparison which so often astonished me, compared the impressions to the red drawings. "These are impressions of lettering," he murmured. "Could be from a pad or from written sheets that once pressed against it. Someone has been storing messages here and retrieving them at leisure." His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with the private fervor of a man who delights in the slow unraveling of design. We followed the trail along the corridor, each step revealing small particulars that before had passed unnoticed. A faint scratch upon the newel post, the gentle flattening of a runner where 2 feet had trodden more often than etiquette allowed, the residue of coal dust traced with a hand that smudged its path. On the landing outside the portrait gallery, the air carried a thinner chill, as if the house had exhaled through that aperture, and there, half concealed beneath the skirting, lay a small pad of writing paper, its pages stained at the corner with the same red. The top leaf bore a single line, hurried and crude. A door. The marks of the pen showed the pressure of practice. The hand that wrote these shapes had not merely copied a dream, but haunted its outline until the dream took on a life of its own. Holmes turned the paper between his fingers, and, for a moment, I saw the old impatience touch him. The impatience of a man who will not be kept from a conclusion by mere atmosphere. "This is no idle prank," he declared. "It is an act of methodical persuasion." He looked about with the keenness of a hawk, and his gaze rested upon the gallery's moulding, where the seams between panels offered a narrower seam than chance. Concealment with ready access. The actor wishes to be able to work at will and to remove his traces with equal ease. This is the handiwork of someone intimately acquainted with the house's structure. The housekeeper's face, when she appeared at the head of the gallery stairs, was a study in indignation betrayed by fear. Mrs. Hargreaves had a manner which pretended to haughty contempt of the lower orders, yet her lip quivered as she met Holmes's steady gaze. "Sir, whoever has done this, it is an outrage upon our lineage," she began, and then, under the pressure of his look, faltered and added, "I would not have it in my household that a woman be frightened under my roof." Holmes's reply was neither soft nor harsh. It was simply incisive. "Madam, are there any servants who move about at odd hours? Any lodgers? Any former members of the household who come and go?" Her answer was a rote list of names and alibis, but there was hesitation around one. Mr. Pell, the groundsman with the limp. "He tends the grounds through the night sometimes, sir," she admitted, "and he has access to the pantry and the passages, though he keeps to himself." At this Holmes's lip hardened. "We shall speak with him." Our interview with Mr. Pell revealed a man not ungenerous in speech, but guarded, with the sort of reserve that springs from old injury and more recent suspicion. He acknowledged a habit of nocturnal walks. The stateliness of certain men drives them to prefer the company of the moon, but he denied all knowledge of any tampering with the walls or of the presence of red ink. Yet when Holmes questioned him about the former tutor, Mr. Thorne, his face tightened as if at the scratch of a saw. "Thorne left queer," he muttered. "Left in a hurry like. Didn't speak to folk much after that. Fine scholar, but with a streak of strange." Holmes seized upon that thread with the dexterity of a man who never allows a loose end to lie. "Where is Mr. Thorne now?" he demanded. Pell's answer was a flung hand and a curt, "Gone to the town, sir. Word was he'd been seeing folk who dealt in curious arts, ink makers, bookbinders, painters who work with pigments strange and old." The phrase caught in the air as if it were a bell. Holmes turned to me, his face lit with a blend of professional satisfaction and somber foreboding. "The trail widens, Watson. Our intruder's means may well involve external artisans who supply the tools for his work. The question is whether he has returned here as a supplicant or as an architect." As we left the landing to follow the leads Pell had offered, I could not shake an image that had lodged like a burr in my mind. The red streak upon Lady Margaret's portrait, curving like a tear that would not be allowed to fall. It seemed to me in those moments that the house's architecture, its basements and attics, its false panels and sleepy servants, was the map of a mind seeking to rewrite a life. Holmes moved with a new, rapid energy, cataloguing ligature and seam, measuring spaces as though he meant to inscribe them upon his memory by touch alone. For my part, I felt the old anxiety of a man who loves order and finds it threatened by a subtler, more invasive disorder, a mind that would, through patient acts, impose itself upon the private imaginings of another. At dusk, we returned to the gallery. The lamps burned lower, and the ancestral faces seemed to press nearer, their painted eyes reflecting the lamp glow like watchful witnesses. Holmes placed the papers and the pad upon a small table and, without ceremony, set his palm upon the surface of the largest drawing. He closed his eyes for a brief, uncommon moment, as if listening to the whisper of ink upon paper. "There will be a stage," he murmured at last, his voice barely above the hush of the room. "A contrivance intended to produce a final tableau. We must be prepared to interrupt it." The house, which had refused sleep from the first, sighed a long, soft sound as if in acquiescence or in warning. The shadow upon the landing lengthened and folded into the stairs curve, and in that line of darkness I fancied I could see, for a moment, the outline of a figure moving with the steady certainty of one who believes himself invisible. The portrait gallery possessed a temperament of its own, a temperament bred of varnish, oil, and long-kept silences. As Holmes and I stepped back into its corridor that evening, I felt a shift in the air, as though the house had become aware of our intentions and weighed them with cool detachment. The lamps guttered in their sconces, struggling against the tide of dusk that pressed against the windows like a living thing. I remember thinking that if Clara's dreams had shape, they would look like these shadows, lean, restless, and prone to suggestion. Holmes walked ahead of me, his stride swift but soundless, the tails of his coat barely stirring. In such moments he seemed not wholly of the domestic world, but a figure cut from the sharper edges of intellect, one whose presence sharpened the gloom around him. At the far end of the gallery, where Lady Margaret Greystoke's solemn form gazed outward with painted hauteur, the red streak still glistened faintly as though refusing to dry. Holmes halted before it and without turning his head asked, "Watson, what does this alteration say to you?" I gave the portrait my full attention. The red line was unmistakably placed to mimic grief, but also to disturb. "It suggests an intruder intent not merely upon frightening Clara," I replied slowly, "but upon defacing the dignity of the family, an insult directed at the hollow itself." Holmes nodded. "Good. And yet notice the precision." He gestured lightly, his fingers suspended an inch from the canvas. Not a wild stroke, not an accidental spill, a single calculated line. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "This is theatre, Watson, private theatre. The gallery is not the primary audience. Clara is. The villain communicates in symbols, as one might if words proved insufficient or too dangerous." The weight of his words pressed upon me. I turned to look toward the opposite end of the room, where a tall window admitted the faintest trickle of failing daylight. Outside, the yew trees bent slightly in the rising wind, their branches scratching against the panes. The sound echoed the earlier tapping we had heard in the corridor. It was impossible not to feel the house's unease creeping into one's nerves, and for a moment I found myself listening for a footstep that did not come. Holmes began to examine each painting along the wall with painstaking attention. "Observe the dust lines," he murmured. "The frames are shifted, not by much, but enough to suggest someone moved among them recently. Searching, perhaps, or positioning." He paused before a smaller portrait, a child in a white frock, rendered with tender brushwork. Across the lower edge of the frame was a faint smear of red, hardly noticeable unless one were looking for it. "Our phantom enjoys leaving his mark," Holmes said softly. A sudden noise startled us, a muffled thud from the floor above, followed by the whisper of hurried footsteps. Holmes straightened at once. "Not Clara," he said. "Her tread is lighter. This is a man's weight." We were already halfway down the corridor when Mrs. Hargreaves appeared at the stairs' edge, her face alarmed and pallid. "Mr. Holmes," she gasped, "it's the study, the master's study. Something has been disturbed." Holmes motioned for calm, though his own pace quickened. We ascended the stairs and entered a narrow corridor leading to the study, a gloomy chamber lined with shelves whose contents, ledgers, journals, family papers, were the private machinery of the estate. The door stood ajar. A lamp on the desk flickered unevenly, casting long, jerking shadows across the walls. The air smelled faintly of ink and the distinct sweetness of freshly disturbed paper. Holmes stepped inside and surveyed the disarray. A drawer left open, a ledger pulled halfway onto the floor, and upon the blotter a solitary sheet of paper bearing a new drawing in red. This one depicted a human figure, tall, elongated by crude exaggeration, standing behind a seated woman whose bowed head was rendered with startling tenderness. Holmes bent close. "Miss Morley," he said quietly. "This depicts her, and the figure behind her. The posture suggests guardianship or possession." The distinction chilled me. Either implication was disturbing enough. Mrs. Hargreaves wrung her hands. "I told the master those old family rooms ought to stay locked," she muttered. "Ever since Mr. Thorne left, something has felt wrong in that wing." Holmes seized upon the name. "Tell me everything you know of him," he demanded. The housekeeper stiffened, but beneath her propriety lay a tremor of long-concealed unease. "He was peculiar," she admitted. "Bright, yes, but solitary. Spent too many hours pacing the corridors at night. He fancied himself a student of the mind. Kept journals full of nonsense about dreams and hidden selves. When the master dismissed him, he left quietly, but," she swallowed, "not at peace." Holmes straightened, tapping the hour edge of the drawing. "This is not the work of a peaceful man." He opened the fallen ledger and scanned its contents with swift, practiced movements. "Financial accounts," he murmured. "Supplies purchased, payments made." He paused at one entry and tapped the page. "Watson, note the listing here. An expense to an ink maker in the nearby town. Repeated monthly for nearly a year, and the name requesting the ink? Thorne." My breath caught. So he purchased the red ink. "Precisely. And not ordinary ink. This variety is uncommon, made from a pigment that requires special preparation. Expensive, impractical, chosen for effect, and he commissioned it in quantities unnecessary for simple correspondence." Holmes shut the ledger with a decisive snap. "This is the ink of obsession." Mrs. Hargreaves made a small, involuntary sound. "But Mr. Thorne is gone," she whispered. "He cannot be here." Holmes's expression darkened. A man who walks the corridors of the mind rarely leaves them behind. There was a gravity in his tone that suggested he no longer dismissed the possibility of Thorne's return. Indeed, the notion of a dismissed tutor moving silently through Greystoke Hollow, shaping Clara's dreams with deliberate malice, struck me with such vivid clarity that for an instant the room around me seemed to contract. Holmes began to search the study with greater urgency. He opened drawers, lifted ledgers, examined the floorboards, and ultimately crouched near the hearth. "Watson," he called, "bring the lamp." I knelt beside him, holding the light low. Beneath the grate, lodged where only the meticulous eye could notice, was a small object wrapped in black cloth. Holmes retrieved it with the care of one handling fragile evidence. The cloth unfurled to reveal a tiny glass vial, its contents unmistakably red. Clara's ink. Holmes turned it so that the firelight struck its surface. "Fresh," he said. "Recently used." He rose to his full height. "Thorne has returned, whether openly or as a phantom in the walls, and he intends to complete whatever design he began." The last words had scarcely left his mouth when a faint creak sounded from the far end of the corridor, the same heavy tread we had heard earlier. We stepped into the hall just as a shadow slipped around the corner. Holmes darted forward with a speed that belied his usual languor, but the corridor was long and the figure fleet. By the time we reached the landing, the shadow had vanished, leaving behind only a faint scent of damp wool, and the lingering impression of movement. Holmes halted, breathing steadily despite the chase. "He knows the house better than we do," he murmured. "He knows how to disappear." He surveyed the landing with the meticulous gaze of a man accustomed to drawing meaning from the smallest details. His attention settled upon a subtle irregularity in the wallpaper, an indentation shaped like the pressure of a hand. He touched it lightly. "Here," he said. He braced himself. He watched us. The notion that the intruder had been observing us silently as we examined his handiwork was disturbing beyond measure. I felt the hairs rise upon the back of my neck. Holmes, however, remained composed, though his eyes gleamed with renewed resolve. "This ends," he said quietly. "No man who intrudes upon another's dreams can be permitted to write their waking life." As we descended to inform Clara of our findings, a passing gust rattled the gallery windows, and for a moment the red streak on Lady Margaret's portrait shimmered in the lamplight like a fresh wound. The house, it seemed, had not yet exhausted its capacity for unease. The storm that gathered over Greystoke Hollow that night was not wholly of the skies. Though the wind battered the shutters and the rain etched restless patterns across the window panes, the atmosphere within the house was heavier still, laden with tension that seemed to thicken the very air we breathed. Clara had withdrawn to her chambers at Holmes's gentle insistence, Eliza keeping vigilant watch beside her door. Holmes and I remained in the study, the vial of red ink resting on the desk between us like a drop of blood that had been torn from the heart of the mystery. Holmes stood with one hand braced against the mantel, staring at the ledger that had revealed Thorne's connection to the inkmaker. There was a stillness about him that I had come to recognize as the prelude to a leap in reasoning, a stillness so taut, hummed like a plucked string. "Watson," he said quietly, "consider this. A man dismissed from these halls, living now in obscurity, yet continuing to commission the ink that has appeared nightly beside Miss Morley's bed. Why persist? Why return?" He turned sharply. "Obsession alone is insufficient explanation. There is intent, a design." Before I could answer, a faint thump sounded from the floorboards behind the study desk. A soft, weighty sound, too muted to be accidental. Holmes's head snapped toward it. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, knelt, and pressed his ear to the floor. "There," he whispered, "a hollow beneath." I fetched the lamp without being asked, and together we examined the edges of the carpet. It had been slightly disturbed, as though someone had lifted it recently and replaced it with care. Holmes lifted the corner. Beneath was a wide oak board, its grain darkened by age. The metal nails held it in place, but one lay ever so slightly raised. Holmes's eyes gleamed. He used this. He must have needed access frequently. He slipped a thin blade beneath the board, and with the precision of a violinist lifting a string, he eased it upward until the nail gave way with a soft, weary sigh. Beneath the board yawned a narrow cavity, a channel that seemed to have been carved deliberately between beams. Within it lay several tightly bound journals. Tomato onto a stack of folded paper and a small wooden box sealed with twine. Holmes lifted one journal and brushed the dust from its cover. The handwriting inside was unmistakably the same crude, angular hand we had traced in the red ink, but here it appeared in black, hurried and disordered. Each page swarmed with lines that bore the mark of agitation, passages of rambling theory, lists of dreams, his dreams, Clara's dreams, or dreams he imagined belonged to the house itself, and sketches that resembled the red drawings she had found. He turned the pages swiftly, absorbing content at a pace no ordinary man could match. "These are Thorne's," Holmes said, voice low. "Watson, look at the dates." He kept writing long after his dismissal. "The entries suggest he believed Clara possessed some gift, some rare capacity to dream truths others could not see." His tone hardened. He believes he is teaching her, guiding her. The drawings are not simply intimidation, they are instruction. A chill ran down my spine. I imagined Clara waking each morning to see her nightmares traced upon paper, believing herself haunted by her own subconscious, when in truth she was being manipulated by a man who fancied himself the architect of her mind. "Holmes," I murmured, "this is madness." "Not madness," Holmes corrected with a grimness that made the room seem darker. "Conviction, and conviction in the hands of a diseased intellect is more perilous than madness." Holmes opened the wooden box next. Inside lay a collection of small bottles, most empty, one containing a few drops of the same brilliant red ink. But beneath the bottles was something more unsettling, a collection of Clara's handwriting samples, pages she had used to tutor the child of the estate. Upon each page, her neat script had been traced over in red, as though Thorne had rehearsed mimicking her hand. One sheet bore the phrase, "I see you," repeated several times. Another contained only a single sentence, "The door will open when I am ready." Holmes closed the box with quiet force. "He practices imitation," he said. "He means to write as her, think as her, reshape her reality entirely. Watson, Thorne is attempting psychological possession." Outside, thunder rolled across the hill, shaking the window panes. The house groaned in response, as though resenting our intrusion into its hidden spaces. Holmes rose and carried the journals to the desk, arranging them by date. "We must determine the pattern," he said. "Obsessions leave trails. They return to their point of origin." He opened the earliest journal. The entry described Clara's arrival at Greystoke Hollow, written with an admiration that bordered on reverence. The next few pages chronicled Thorne's growing fixation. He wrote of Clara's luminous dreaming, of the purity of her unconscious, of the corridor of endless doors that he believed she alone could access. The dreams she had described to us he had recorded long before she experienced them. "Watson," Holmes said sharply, "do you see it?" He tapped an entry dated some months prior. It described a dream of Clara's, the elongated corridor, the small door, the tapping behind the walls. Yet Clara had told us she had only dreamt those things within the past week. He is not recording her dreams, he is creating them. "How?" I demanded. "How could he influence dreams at such a distance?" Holmes turned another page. He was dismissed, but not entirely removed. He lifted the thin sheet of tracing paper tucked between entries, revealing a rough map of the house, annotated with notes on where sound carried, where panels were loose, where passages widened into hidden alcoves. "He knows every hollow bone of this house. Through scratches, whispers, careful knocking at the edges of sleep, he has fed her fears daily until they flowered into dreams." The revelation was sickening. Clara had never stood alone in her nightmares. She had been shepherded into them. We were still bent over the journals when a sudden cry pierced the stillness, a cry from the upper floors, sharp and desperate. "Clara." Holmes seized the lamp and raced toward the staircase, and I followed with my heart pounding. Her door stood open. Eliza stood inside, pale as parchment, pointing toward the hearth. Clara was there, kneeling on the floorboards, staring at a fresh drawing that had been placed upon the stones. A door, drawn in red. This time, the door was wider, open. Holmes reached her in an instant. "Clara, who delivered this? Did you see anyone?" She shook her head violently. No, I only turned my back for a moment and then it was there. The window hasn't opened. The door was locked." Holmes snatched the drawing. The ink was still wet. "Watson," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a verdict. "He's in the walls. He's in the house now." A gust of wind slammed the shutters, and the lamp flickered dangerously. Somewhere deep within the hollow, a floorboard groaned as though shifting beneath an unseen foot. Holmes stepped away from Clara and lifted the lamp high, illuminating every corner, then narrowing his gaze to the panel beside her bed. the same panel that had bubbled with hidden movement before. "This ends tonight," he said. And as we followed him into the corridor, the house, still sleepless, still listening, seemed to hold its breath. The following morning broke with a cold, colorless clarity that did nothing to lift the oppression that had settled upon Greystoke Hollow. The storm had blown itself to exhaustion in the night, leaving the ground slick and gleaming, the yew trees bowed beneath glistening droplets that clung to their branches like beads of glass. Yet inside the hollow, the atmosphere remained unchanged, thick with secrets, stale with troubled sleep, and sharpened by the knowledge that Thorn's presence was no longer a matter of speculation, but of fact. Holmes wasted no time. Before Clara had risen, before Mrs. Hargreaves had lit the kitchen fires, he had already examined the fresh drawing once more, comparing it to those stolen from beneath the floorboards. "This door," he murmured, "is no mere symbol. It is a location, a threshold he intends her to reach." He traced the edges of the drawing with a fingertip. An open door signifies transition, a passage from one state to another. He intends to invite her into something. The question is, what? He laid the drawing aside with a precise motion. "There is someone in the nearby town," he continued, "who supplied Thorn with his ink. Such a person may know more than they realize." Thus we set out before breakfast, the early sun weak and filtered through pale clouds. Our carriage bumped along the uneven road toward the town. Holmes, silent, yet unmistakably burning with the restless energy that marked his deepest analytical trances. I watched him from the opposite seat, noting the slight tension in his jaw and the way his fingers tapped rhythmically against his knee. He was assembling pieces, hearing echoes none of us could hear, arranging patterns with that peculiar speed of mind that left even the swiftest among us struggling to keep pace. We arrived at a small cluster of buildings nestled against a stream, a modest town with narrow streets, a few shops, and a telegraph office whose clock chimed with punctual solemnity. Holmes led us to a cramped storefront marked Pender and Sons, stationers, copyists, and ink specialists. The window displayed rows of quills, sealing wax, and glass jars filled with pigments of various hues. The bell over the door tinkled sharply when we entered, and the scent of gum arabic and drying parchment enveloped us. Behind the counter stood a man of late middle years with a stooped posture and ink-stained fingers. A man whose life, I imagined, had been spent in the careful mixing of colors, the steady grinding of pigments, and the quiet familiarity of paper. When Holmes presented his card, the man's eyes widened. Recognition of the name flashed across his face. "Mr. Holmes," he said uncertainly. "How may I assist?" Holmes placed the vial of red ink, Thorn's vial, upon the counter. The man blanched. I know this ink. It is my own formula." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Tell me everything, Mr. Pender. Who commissioned it? For what purpose? How often?" The man hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the vial. He held it to the light and shook his head. "I warned him," he murmured. "I told him this pigment was not intended for writing. It is too potent, too vivid, a theatrical ink, not suited for correspondence or ledgers." Holmes leaned forward. "You refer to Mr. Thorn?" Pender swallowed. "Yes, Mr. Thorn. He came to me nearly a year ago, asking for an ink that would leave an impression upon the mind." Those were his words. I assumed he meant decorative work or artistic experiments, but he asked for a color that would resist fading, something unforgettable, something the eye could not ignore. Holmes's glance slid to me. "A psychological tool," he murmured. Pender continued, his voice tightening with anxiety. He returned frequently, every month precisely. He spoke of creating a language beyond words. He wanted ink that, pardon the phrase, burned itself into memory. Holmes's voice took on a darker timbre. "And you supplied him?" The man bowed his head. I did. A man must earn his living, and he paid well. Holmes studied him with unblinking intensity. Did he ever say for whom the ink was intended? Pender hesitated, then nodded. He said it was for someone gifted, someone who dreamed in colors he wished to understand. Holmes stiffened. Clara. Pender's face creased with confusion. I only know he spoke of a young woman, yes. He said her mind carried images worth capturing. He paused. He also asked me about inks that could be seen only in certain light, under lamplight or when held at an angle. He was fascinated by such things. Holmes absorbed this silently, his expression hardening into something like grim resolve. Mr. Pender, he said at last, your information may prevent a grave tragedy. Should Mr. Thorne return for more ink, you will notify the nearest constable at once, and you will send word to me at Baker Street. Pender nodded rapidly, gratitude and fear mingling in his eyes. Outside, the air felt heavier, as though the hollow's shadow had reached even this small town. Holmes strode ahead, his coat billowing. The ink is not merely a tool, he said. It is a medium. Thorne believes he can teach Clara through symbols, teach her by guiding her dreams, shaping her waking fears. He sees himself not as tormentor, but as mentor. The idea revolted me. A mentor who stalks his pupil, who creeps through walls, who copies her hand. Holmes stopped abruptly and turned to face me. Precisely. It is the belief of a fanatic. We returned to Greystoke Hollow with haste. The house received us with its usual chill indifference, but as we stepped into the dim entry hall, I sensed something had shifted in our absence. Eliza met us with a trembling curtsy. Sir, Mr. Holmes. Miss Morley is unwell. She barely touched her breakfast. She's pale as a ghost. Holmes went to her room immediately. Clara sat by the window, wrapped in a shawl, staring at something she clutched in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes held an unnatural brightness. Mr. Holmes, she whispered, it's happening again. Every time I close my eyes, I hear him. Holmes knelt before her. Clara, what do you hear? A pen, she whispered, tears brimming. Scratching. Always behind the wall, and last night I dreamed the door opened wider. Holmes removed the object from her hands gently. It was another drawing, this one showing a staircase descending into darkness. At the top of the staircase stood a small figure, Clara, while below in the shadows, two eyes shone like coals. Holmes examined it grimly. The cellar, he said. He wants her to go there. I felt a chill ripple through me. Holmes, you don't think I do, he said quietly. Thorne is building toward something, a final scene. He is a dramatist of the mind, Watson, and every dream, every drawing is a cue. He stood abruptly. Come, we must examine the cellar before he can lead her there. The descent into the deepest part of Greystoke Hollow was like entering the lungs of some long-slumbering beast. The air grew colder as we moved down the narrow steps, and the walls grew damp with the seep of ancient water. Holmes held the lamp high, illuminating the stone floor. And there, scratched into the grime of the cellar wall, was a message. Not in ink, in chalk, the very same pale chalk Clara used to tutor the child of the estate. I am waiting. Holmes's face tightened. He wants her to see this, to follow. He means to draw her here. Perhaps tonight. A gust of stale air swept through the cellar, extinguishing the lamp's flame. In the darkness that followed, I could have sworn I heard it again, the faint, deliberate scratching of a pen upon paper. We returned to London with the weight of Greystoke Hollow pressing upon our very bones. Though the journey from the countryside to the city was but a few hours, it felt as though we had crossed a great and troubled distance, moving from the suffocating atmosphere of a house besieged by unseen hands into the restless, sprawling vastness of the metropolis. Yet even London's familiar bustle seemed muted as we arrived. The clip of horses on wet cobblestones and the hiss of gas lamps blooming to life along the Strand offered none of their usual comfort. It was as though the hollow had followed us, whispering still from the recesses of memory. Holmes was unusually silent as our hansom wound through the late afternoon traffic. His face, ordinarily so animated in the heat of deduction, had settled into a tense mask, as if deep thought had fixed itself into his very features. Only the rhythmic drumming of his fingers upon his knee betrayed the quickened calculation at work within him. "Watson," he said at last, eyes still trained on the passing shop fronts, "Thorn's influence is not confined to Greystoke Hollow. He has ties here, threads in London's quieter corners that must be traced if we are to understand the full measure of his design." When the cab stopped outside a modest row of buildings off the Strand, Holmes leapt to the pavement with renewed purpose. We entered a narrow passage lined with shops catering to writers, artists, and intellectual eccentrics, a district of powdered pigments, rare pamphlets, and chemical curiosities. Holmes navigated it with the certainty of a man following a scent only he could detect. At last, he halted at a small establishment with a soot-darkened sign that read Mr. Lytton's Reclamation and Biblio Repair. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of glue, dust, and leather bindings. Books lay in careful disarray, some open to be mended, others stripped of their covers like skeletons awaiting reconstruction. Mr. Lytton, a stooped fellow with pince-nez perched precariously upon his nose, looked up with mild irritation at the intrusion. Holmes displayed the vial of red ink. "Tell me, Mr. Lytton, have you seen this shade before?" The man's eyebrows shot upward. "Ah, the mad tutor's ink." At Holmes's slight tilt of the head, Lytton elaborated. "A fellow came in months ago. Disturbed type, hands shaking, eyes too bright. He wanted old books with blank margins. Said he needed space to annotate dreams." Lytton sniffed derisively. "I told him dreams are best left in sleep, but he purchased 6 volumes. Paid in coin, no conversation." "Did he give his name?" asked Holmes. "None. But he left something behind." Lytton rummaged beneath the counter and produced a slip of paper. "Found this on my floor the morning after his visit." Holmes took the paper. It bore a small sketch, a door, half open, and beneath it, in red, a single word: "Soon." Holmes folded the paper with the care of a man handling a venomous insect. "This was not merely forgetfulness," he murmured. "It was a breadcrumb, a signpost meant to be found." We left the shop and continued deeper into the city's quieter arteries. Holmes's pace increased as he pieced together locations from Thorn's journals, shops, addresses, obscure mentions of voices heard between walls, and London's hidden angles. His deductions led us next to a modest structure near Covent Garden, a building housing a loose collective of amateur painters and failed poets. Its corridors smelled of turpentine and melancholy. Inside, an unshaven clerk recognized Thorn's likeness at once when Holmes sketched it from memory. Yes, the clerk muttered. "Thin fellow. Nervous. Said he was searching for a color that could show the mind's edge." He pointed toward a cluttered table littered with charcoal scraps. "He spoke of a governess, said her dreams were scripts he meant to follow." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Did he meet anyone else here?" "Only that bookseller across the lane. Lent him a volume on symbolism and ancient rites. A strange fellow, your Mr. Thorn." We crossed the lane to the bookseller's shop, a cavernous place of dim shelves and whispering pages. The bookseller, a thin man with a twitching moustache, regarded Holmes with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. When Holmes mentioned Clara Morley by name, the man's face drained of color. "He spoke of her," the bookseller whispered. "Said she dreamed what he could not. Called her the vessel. I refused to sell him further volumes, for there was something feverish in his manner. He muttered that he must return to the Hollow. that the final threshold waited for her. Holmes leaned in. What threshold? The bookseller shook his head. He would not say, only that she would walk through the open door if guided correctly. A hush fell between us, an unnatural stillness amidst London's ceaseless noise. Holmes turned toward the door with abrupt intensity. "Watson," he said, "we must return to Clara at once. He has planned something irrevocable. The cellar message, the open door, the staircase. These are cues of escalation. Thorne is approaching his final act." As we rode back toward Baker Street to gather what Holmes called essential instruments, I noted the worry etched beneath his composure. He studied the city passing around us as if the very brickwork might whisper Thorne's next step. When we reached 221B, Holmes retrieved a small case from beneath his desk, one I recognized immediately. It contained lockpicks, vials of reagents, a length of wire, and a revolver seldom used but always cleaned. Holmes snapped the case shut. "Watson," he said in a voice stripped of hesitation, "this is no longer an investigation. It is an intervention." "But Holmes, what is his endgame? What does he seek from Clara?" Holmes paused at the door. "He seeks recognition. He seeks a pupil. He seeks—" He hesitated, and for the first time that day, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "He seeks to draw her into the world he has constructed within his mind. The open door is an invitation into his madness." The hansom bearing us back toward Greystoke Hollow sped through the growing dusk. Lamps flickered against the misting air, and the city's grand facades gave way to lonely roads and darkening countryside. Holmes sat rigid as a drawn bowstring, every faculty honed toward the confrontation ahead. As the hollow loomed into view, its silhouette stark against the last failing glow of the horizon, I felt an ancient instinct tighten in my chest. Something waited there, something patient, something that had whispered through walls and pressed inked messages into the waking world. Holmes placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Steel yourself, Watson. Tonight we step not merely into a house, but into the theater of a disordered mind." And as the carriage halted before the gates, I could have sworn the house itself murmured, an exhalation from its hollow bones, as though preparing for the final act. Night had already folded itself around Greystoke Hollow when we crossed its threshold once more, the lamps within flickering like the hearts of timid creatures. The entire estate seemed to crouch in expectation, as though the walls themselves understood that the final strands of Thorne's design were tightening. The air felt charged, too still, too watchful, and even the creak of the door hinges struck my nerves like a whispered warning. Holmes paused upon entering, his keen gaze sweeping the dim hall. "He's here," he murmured, barely above breath. "I can feel the pattern closing." Eliza appeared at once, anxious and pale. "Mr. Holmes, Miss Morley is in her chambers, but she is changed, sir, quiet, withdrawn. She barely speaks." Holmes motioned for us to move swiftly, his expression hardening. Clara's distress, more than any clue or mark, seemed to cut at him with unusual sharpness. We reached her door, and Holmes knocked gently. Clara sat by the window, her form silhouetted against what little moonlight pierced the trees. The shawl around her shoulders looked too heavy for her slight frame. She turned when we entered, but her eyes, usually bright with emotion, were clouded, unfocused, fixed upon something internal. Holmes knelt beside her with uncharacteristic softness. "Clara, you must tell me, what did you dream?" Her lips parted, but it took a long moment for her voice to emerge. "He was there," she whispered. "In the dream. Not behind me this time. Beside me, speaking softly." Her breath trembled. "He told me I must finish what he began, that I must go to the door." Holmes's jaw tightened. "And what else?" Clara hesitated, fighting some inner storm. "He said—" She closed her eyes. "He said I was meant for this, that I was the only one who understood." That I was... Her voice faltered as if the very word tasted of poison. Chosen. Holmes rose slowly, the weight of her words sinking deep into his thoughts. Watson, he murmured, the man is escalating. He now speaks to her in her dreams, not merely through symbols. His influence has reached a more intimate and dangerous stage. Clara's trembling grew more pronounced. Mr. Holmes, I feel as though I am losing myself. Her confession was barely audible. As though the house is inside me now, whispering its own thoughts. Holmes placed a reassuring hand upon her shoulder. You are not losing yourself, Miss Morley. You are being cornered, and cornering is the weapon of the cowardly. Clara's breathing out slightly at his tone. But I must ask you something difficult. Do you know why Thorne fixated upon you? Her expression shifted, puzzled, then fearful, then strangely blank. I don't, she whispered. I never spoke to him more than in passing. He was the child's tutor before I came. He always seemed distant, cold. I thought he barely noticed me. Holmes's eyes sharpened. He noticed, quite intensely, and long before you suspected. He produced one of Thorne's journals retrieved from beneath the floorboards and laid it gently on Clara's lap. This, he said, is his first entry after you entered the household. Clara opened it with trembling fingers. Her breath caught at the sight of her own name scrawled with obsessive repetition across the page. Beneath it were lines describing her movements, when she walked in the garden, when she lit the lamps in the schoolroom, when she spoke to the child, even when she looked out the window at dusk. She read the words, her face draining of color. He watched me, she whispered. All along. Holmes nodded gravely. He did more than watch. He constructed a narrative around you. He formed a belief that your dreams contained truths, that you possessed a rare faculty, one he believed he must nurture or claim. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the journal. I moved to take it from her, but she held it close as though it were a venomous creature whose fangs she wished to understand before she cast it away. Holmes paced to the hearth. Watson, consider the nature of obsession. A man like Thorne, isolated, clever, unused to companionship, seeks meaning wherever he can impose it. Clara's presence gave him a new structure for his fractured imagination. He saw significance where there was none, and then labored to prove his imagined connection by forcing her dreams to match his preconceptions. I felt the grim truth settle heavily in my chest. He created her nightmares, I said, to justify his belief that she was extraordinary. Precisely. Holmes's face was carved from shadow and resolve. He manufactured the evidence of his delusion, and each drawing, each whisper, each step he took in the walls was meant to convince her and himself that his fantasy was real. Clara had risen, moving toward the hearth with the slow, hesitant steps of someone approaching her own reflection for the first time. "But why me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "What could I have done to draw such madness?" Holmes regarded her with a gentleness rare even in his kindest moments. "Nothing. His obsession is not rooted in your actions, but in his needs. He required a muse, and he believed your dreams could be shaped to fit his fractured philosophy. You became the canvas for his delusion." She lowered her gaze. "Then why did he return?" Holmes's eyes flickered with a chilling clarity. "Because you are no longer the Clara he imagined. Because you resisted, and obsession sharpens when denied." A thud sounded from somewhere deep within the house, distant but unmistakably human. Clara startled violently. Holmes raised a hand. "Watson, he's moving." We followed the sound through the corridor and down to the first floor. Holmes walked ahead with purposeful strides, pausing occasionally to trace the marks upon the walls. Scratches we had missed before, smudges of chalk, faint prints of fingers pressed in haste or frenzy. Holmes stopped suddenly. "The cellar. He has returned to prepare his final act," We made for the cellar stairs, the air growing colder with each step. Holmes held the lamp aloft, its flame swaying. The walls seemed to pulse, with a faint echo of sound, scratching, rhythmic, patient. At the bottom of the stairs lay a fresh drawing, a staircase, descending into the dark. Holmes lifted it with gloved hands. "He knows we follow," he said. "This is not merely taunting. This is ceremony." "Holmes," I said, feeling dread coil in my chest, "what does he intend to do?" He turned to me with eyes that gleamed like steel in lamplight. "Watson, Thorne wishes to create identity through fear. He means for Clara to step willingly into the narrative he has built. The open door is not merely an image, it is an invitation, and he means to be waiting on the other side." A creak sounded above, Eliza calling Clara's name in alarm. We raced back up the stairs. Clara was gone. Holmes reached the landing first, scanning for signs. A draft slipped through a narrow opening in the wall, one we had not found earlier. "He has taken her," Holmes said, voice taut, "but not by force. He lured her through the corridor into the attic passage." He turned to me with urgency that crackled like electricity. "Watson, Thorne is bringing her to the final door." A sound resonated from deep above us, a soft, terrible tapping like a pen against hollow wood. And in that instant, I understood with stark clarity what Holmes meant. The last scene was beginning. We ascended toward the attic passage with a haste sharpened by dread, the narrow stairwell seeming to constrict around us like the inside of a throat. Holmes moved first, his lamp casting wild, angular shadows that danced across the walls, revealing the dust disturbed by a single set of hurried footprints, Clara's small, uncertain steps overlaid by the longer, surer strides of the man who pursued her dreams. A cold draught swept downward, damp with the scent of attic timber and something else. Ink, thin and metallic, as if the very air had been stained by Thorne's intentions. Holmes paused for the briefest moment, inhaling as though listening for patterns hidden within breath itself, then pressed forward with renewed determination. The attic was a long corridor of slanted beams and forgotten furniture, draped with sheets that billowed faintly as we passed. The boards creaked beneath our feet with a hollow resonance that set my teeth on edge. Somewhere ahead, another creak answered. Lighter, tremulous. Clara. Holmes lifted the lamp, illuminating a trail of chalk marks upon the beams, each drawn with frantic haste, arrows pointing forward, crescents, door shapes. They formed a symbolic map of Thorne's design, his mental architecture rendered upon the attic walls like a fevered scripture. Holmes studied them as a code-breaker might study a cipher. "He is guiding her to a predetermined place," he murmured, "a locus of meaning he has cultivated, the final threshold." A sudden whispering breeze brushed past us, carrying with it a sound I shall never forget, soft, deliberate tapping like a pen against hollow wood. Holmes's face hardened. "He is near," he said, "and he is signaling her." His lamp revealed a narrow aperture in the wall, an old servant's passage, scarcely wider than a man's shoulders. The boards around it bore the marks of recent use. Holmes squeezed through without hesitation, and I followed, my hands brushing cold plaster as we descended into a tight, spiraling hallway. The air was colder here, the darkness thicker, as though we were entering a secret held too long within the bones of the house. Then we heard her. "Mr. Holmes," Clara's voice, barely above breath, thin, quavering, pitched with a blend of fear and dreamlike confusion. Holmes answered at once. "Clara, stay where you are. We are coming." His voice, though calm, carried a force that cut through the suffocating stillness. We pushed onward, the passage turning, narrowing, then opening abruptly into a small, forgotten chamber beneath the eaves. Clara stood in the far corner, pale as moonlit snow, her hands clasped before her as though in prayer. Before her, On the opposite wall, Thorn had drawn a door, the final door, large and vivid, rendered entirely in his red ink. The lines shimmered in the lamplight with a glossy wetness. Beneath it, in sharp strokes, he had written, "Come through." But Thorn himself was not at the door. He stood beside Clara. He was a gaunt, hollow-cheeked figure, his hair in disarray, his eyes fever-bright with a terrible, misguided triumph. In his right hand he held a pen still wet with ink. In his left he touched Clara's shoulder with gentle familiarity, as though guiding a pupil to her lesson. At Holmes's arrival he did not flinch, nor did he appear surprised. Instead he smiled, a thin, trembling smile filled with the brittle certainty of a man whose fantasies have woven themselves too tightly around his mind. "You are late, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly. "She understands now. She sees the path. She dreams as I dream." Holmes stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Thorn and me. "Clara sees nothing of your design," he said, voice cold as steel. "You have manipulated her, tormented her, forced your delusions upon her through cowardly means." Thorn's smile widened. "Means are irrelevant when the end is illumination. She was drifting without purpose, until I gave her meaning. I helped her see beyond the veil. I guided her to the threshold." Clara pressed back against the wall, her breath trembling in her throat. "He said I must finish the dream," she whispered desperately. "That it was meant for me, that the door would open." Holmes moved still closer, his gaze fixed upon Thorn like a blade. "Clara," he said softly without turning, "look to me. The door is not real, it is paint, nothing more. The dreams he gave you are not prophecies, they are impositions." Thorn's expression darkened. "You misunderstand entirely. The door is real because she believes in it. Dreams shape truth when nurtured correctly. Her mind is a chamber with many rooms, and I have opened those rooms for her. She's ready to step through." Holmes raised a hand, palm outward, a gesture both assertive and calming. "Thorn," he said, "you have inflicted enough harm upon this young woman. Let her go." Thorn tightened his grip upon Clara's shoulder. "She is not a victim. She is my creation, my culmination." His voice rose with trembling fervor. "We will go through the door together." Holmes stepped fully between Clara and Thorn now, blocking the tutor's reach. His coat brushed Clara's trembling hands, and she clung to the contact as though it anchored her to waking life. "You will not touch her again," Holmes said, and though his voice remained calm, there was a force behind it that brooked no argument. Thorn's composure cracked at last. The mask of pedagogical gentleness shattered, revealing the raw desperation beneath. "You cannot stop what has already begun," he cried. "She has seen the door. She knows the design." Holmes's reply was swift, merciless. "No, you know the design, and you labor to force it upon her." With a sudden lunge, Thorn reached for Clara, but Holmes moved faster than I had ever seen him. He seized Thorn's wrist, twisting it sharply. The pen fell, clattering upon the floor and rolling in a thin arc of red. Thorn cried out, his feverish strength surprising for a man of his build, but Holmes held him with unyielding precision. "Watson, help me restrain him," he commanded, and I rushed forward, grappling Thorn's other arm. The struggle was brief but violent. Thorn fought with the desperation of a man defending the only world he believed to be real. Yet between us, we forced him to the floor, binding his wrists with the wire Holmes carried for contingencies such as this. When at last Thorn lay still, gasping, his eyes no longer shone with triumph, but with an unimaginable sorrow. Clara sank to her knees, sobbing, the sound ringing painfully through the cramped chamber. Holmes rose and went to her at once. He knelt beside her, and though he spoke no words, the steadiness of his presence seemed to draw her back from the precipice of her terror. She clutched his sleeve, grounding herself in the reality of his nearness. I looked to Thorn. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, but the fire in his eyes had burned itself nearly out. "I only wanted her to see," he whispered hoarsely, to understand. Holmes met his gaze with cold clarity. You wanted her to become the character you had invented, but Clara Morley does not exist for your fantasies, Thorne. She is her own. Silence fell. Outside, dawn was beginning, its first pale light seeping through the cracks in the attic boards. Holmes helped Clara to her feet and guided her gently toward the stairs. "You are safe now," he said, his voice quiet, his hand steady at her back. When we stepped out of the attic passage, the first warm beam of sunrise touched Clara's face. For the first time in days, she closed her eyes without trembling. Later, as we stood by the great windows of Greystoke Hollow, Holmes watched the horizon with an expression I rarely saw, a contemplative melancholy, softened at the edges. "Watson," he murmured, "dreams are fragile things. They may illuminate, but they may also ensnare. This young woman will need time to reclaim hers." And as the last of the night's darkness receded, a solitary note of red ink remained upon the attic wall. Dry at last, harmless, its menace dissolved by the coming day. Holmes turned away. The case of the girl who drew her dreams in red ink was over.